Hello and welcome to week 2, which is focusing on what makes the news. So the chapters this week, the readings are all dedicated towards some exploration of what makes the news, how journalists report news, and sort of biases that you might see in news reporting. So to start things off, quick profile of U.S. journalists. So within traditional media especially, majority of journalists are white males. Women are more likely to be present in newspapers and news magazines, while non-white males are likely to be present in radio and television, but they're still generally underrepresented groups compared to traditional white male journalists. The majority of journalists have some form of college education, and their political positions tend to be moderate to liberal. At least that's how they describe themselves. They tend to take positions, internationalist positions, and are suspicious of military intervention. So they tend to prefer economic and military diplomatic strategies over military intervention. They tend to be suspicious of large institutions, such as corporations and large government. But the research seems to suggest, and we'll talk about this more with the bias stuff, is that despite the self-description, most journalists, because of the restraints of professional norms, organizational norms, economic pressures, things like that, do seem to at least attempt to be fair in their coverage. To the extent to which they succeed, of course, is a bit more subjective, but they at least seem to make an effort to try to be objective and fair in their coverage despite it. But still, essentially, your prototypical journalist is going to be like David Fahrenthold here from the Washington Post. White, male, college educated, and other demographics are getting more representation, particularly amongst minorities. Women have been hovering about a third of media for a while. But outside of traditional media and new media, it's more difficult to get information on demographics because a lot of blogs are temporary. They kind of die off. Or they're anonymous. There's that level of screen behind, the internet and yourself. And so it's much harder to get demographics in newer media, particularly if you're talking blogs and internet-based media sources. So it's much harder to get demographics, so it's hard to say for sure what the demographic makeup. What little we do know seems to suggest that some of the more active and larger blogs, many of them still somewhat are like traditional media in the form of at least being usually college-educated individuals. But other than that, getting a good sense of the demographics of more newer media sources is much more difficult. So the reason things like the makeup of the journalist is important is because of gatekeeping, which is going to be a very important concept throughout the entirety of this course, really. And what gatekeeping is referring to is just the various decisions that are made throughout the process of the development of a news story that eventually determines, if it gets reported or not, how it's reported, what sources are used, everything in terms of what eventually creates that final product is gatekeeping. And you can think of it in terms of you have like the editor or the disc jockey or the publisher or the director or, anyone who is in a position where they are making the decisions. They're in charge of the gate that determines does this piece of media get published or not. And, there's the list there of some people. So when it comes to decision of, why does the media report on this but not this, you have to think of it in terms of what factors have influenced the decisions and have encouraged the people who make those decisions to favor this story over another. And that's what we're going to get into in this sort of first part of this week's lecturing. So before getting too much into that, the other term that's important to understand is beats. So beats are basically regular listening posts established by news organizations in places where events of interest are likely to occur. In other words, a beat is something that the news organization sets up to regularly get information that they perceive to be of interest. And so common places they'll assign somebody to regularly cover. It might be legislative bodies, major cities, international organizations, anywhere they perceive, we'll be able to get a lot of information out of this place that can make for good, interesting stories. Now, most traditional media basically have the same beats. And so you tend to get a lot of very similar coverage. You turn to any of the major traditional media sources, your broadcast, your newspapers, so they're going to be covering pretty much the same topics. And in fact, that's sort of a general thing, even with new media, is a lot of your major new media, your cable, 24-hour news networks, for example, tend to cover the same topics, but maybe difference in the framing and opinion and thing like that, but they cover at least the same topics. And so this has led some to have essentially argued with the news media and with these decisions mean is that the news is almost like a beam of a searchlight. They kind of sporadically look around for the most interesting and dramatic news and highly focus on intense coverage of that, but often means many areas are still in the dark. They go uncovered. And the beat system also means there's a tendency to emphasize predictable events that can be planned ahead and that, the organization can prepare for. So that's why speeches and, events and elections, things that they can, we know it's going to happen, so we're going to get somebody there, set up, good to go. Other events, a bit more difficult for them to do, and so a lot of times if it's an unplanned thing, they may not be able to get it covered. But it's important to understand these two terms, gatekeeping, the decisions, and the individuals who make those decisions to influence what gets published, and beats, which are the areas where news often makes an effort. News organizations often make the effort to try to regularly put someone there to get information from. So what influences what gets made into the news? Well, there's a few general major things. First, personal characteristics of the journalist. So your ideology, beliefs, values, just you as a journalist or the journalists themselves, their views, their backgrounds, their experiences are going to influence what they decide is important and what's not. So that's where you get into concerns. For example, a lot of journalists tend to come from, say, northeastern universities, and so they get in a sort of northeast U.S. bubble. That's where that sort of concern is from. It's just their personal experiences. They're not as familiar with experiences in other parts of the country. Can distort what they view as important and what's not, or maybe miss an aspect of a story that maybe someone who was from somewhere else might have caught. Then you have professional norms and values. Again, perception about needing to be objective, fairness, balance, things like that. The professional norms that they get taught in journalism school and the values of their professional organizations. Internal and external competition, so competition with other news media. We want higher ratings than they do. And competition within, I want to advance my career, so I need to be looking out for good stories and compete with other journalists to get better stories than them. Things like that. The broader political context. So news coverage of the U.S. now is going to be different than news coverage 50 years ago because the context of society and the society that the news is being reported out of has changed. Different political beliefs, different levels. So, for example, back in the 60s, there would have been, say, less emphasis on coverage of JFK, John F. Kennedy's, say, various potential sex scandals than there would have been, say, if John F. Kennedy ran today, where there would probably be a lot more willingness by the news media to report on it, while as back then, news might have been less willing to do so. Which also goes into relations with elite sources. So media wants to try to keep friendly enough with elite sources to be able to get access to them and get information they maybe otherwise wouldn't have in the form of leaks and comments and stuff, which could cause them sometimes maybe to be less critical of elite institutions than they should be because of trying to keep friendly enough to keep access that, they need to make news stories. Finally, there's economic pressures. They got to make money. They got to make something that is appealing to enough people to be able to be profitable, get advertiser revenue, things like that. So all those go into just the general process of deciding news stories. For specific stories, these are sort of the things that, are involved. So audience appeal. You got to know what your audience is. You got to know what they like. So if you're Fox News, your audience is older, more conservative, take a conservative spin on. Your MSNBC audience might be younger, more liberal, so you try to appeal to that demographic. Audience appeal, it's knowing what your audience is and what they like and building your content and framing the issues and the coverage in a way that appeals to them. Second, you want a strong impact. You want something that will be big, it catches attention, and it'll be impactful, which is where these other things come in. So violence, conflict, disasters, scandals, anything that is exciting and conflict-driven or can be reported in a conflict-driven way is going to get a lot more coverage than basically people getting along and being friends. And as we'll consistently talk about, this is probably one of the biggest criteria and the one that's most oftenly employed is this emphasis on conflict and drama. Familiarity is another important one. It's people like stories about the familiar, so you're going to oftentimes see the same people get talked about in the news a lot. Some of this, of course, is intentional. President gets talked about because they're a major figure, but, celebrities and other individuals will often get talked about quite a bit. Proximity, the closer it is to home, essentially, the more likely it is the news will report on it. Especially a big deal if you're talking about coverage of foreign events. Foreign events don't get talked a lot in American news, except to the extent to which it directly impacts America, United States. And then timely, and if it's novel. Breaking news gets more attention than this is the same issue we've been dealing with for several decades, and there's no real new updates on it. So unless there's a breaking update on something, oftentimes long-term things kind of get thrown under the bus, or they kind of don't get as much attention as the newest, latest breaking news. So these specific criteria, this emphasis on dramatic new events over other things, is going to be a very common theme and a lot of what we're going to talk about on news media. There's also production constraints, though. So it's not just what stories people think is attention. It's also to what extent can you actually report it in terms of your technology and your production capabilities. So tight deadlines often emphasize a need to edit and publish news rapidly, particularly, say, during a crisis situation where people want information and they want it now. That can cause problems with maybe misinformation or wrong information getting published, and once it's out there, it's really hard to kind of correct it. There's the difficulty of getting access can cause issues. So because of a difficulty of getting access, there's a lot of emphasis on-scene observers, asking people in the area who are witnesses and bringing in experts to talk about it instead of just reporting on the information. So this is why you might get here's something that happened. Now we're going to ask a bunch of people why they think that's important. Difficulty getting access. Late breaking stories, stories that happen at the end of the news cycle, at the end of the day, oftentimes get dumped unless it's a really big deal. And then it might get covered, moved on to the next day. Maybe not so much an issue on, say, a 24-hour news site, but still, basically, it's like if you bring in a story and they're about to close for the day, go home, go to sleep. Unless it's a big deal, might get dropped. A lot of these things put pressure that encourage very minimal amount of investigation time. So deadlines, lack of resources. The lack of resources is a big one because a lot of news has lost resources over the last decades, particularly at state and local level. And so the lack of resources means very minimal amount of investigation time. It's, we got some information, we're going to publish it, don't have really time to really look into it in depth. And so this tends to favor just relaying information from, say, government sources and elites and organizations without a lot of double checking or getting in depth. Just, hey, this organization, basically it's in the sense of, well, we don't have the time to analyze this ourselves. Here's a report from an organization that analyzed it instead, and here's what they said about it. And then finally, if the story doesn't make this is particularly a big deal, on television, if it doesn't make a visually appealing story, it's less likely to get reported. In other words, you have to get good visuals, good video and photos, and something that people can see and watch and observe during the news story. If it's not visually appealing, it's going to be much more difficult to get access and get that story told. So we have, for example, here on CNN, sometime back in June. So just kind of looking at these criteria, we can kind of get a sense just from looking at the CNN website page. So for example, crime, scandal, drama, at least half of this, or a third of this page is being covered up completely about a criminal case of a woman who basically told her boyfriend that he'd be better off dead, and she was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. You can just see a lot of emphasis on this new page is just covered by this one story. Then you got drama, it's heavily personalized, it's dramatic, scandal, crime, grade A news material. Meanwhile, in the political stories, Trump investigated over Comey, Russia, a lot of the emphasis is on Trump, Russia, again, scandal, there's late breaking statement by Trump, controversy, opinion pieces, almost all the political story on top political stories, Trump, Russia, controversy. And then one of the pieces that's not Trump and Russia controversy is still a more controversy and a top story that's a foreign story, but even in that case it's about a fire and conflict and controversy as two political elites, the mayor of London and the British Prime Minister Theresa May, going at it about response to this event. Then finally, you've got your familiar individuals, still got some controversy, the Cosby sexual assault trial. And then a thing about Obama talking with Jay-Z. I personally don't know why that's a top political story, but apparently it is. Again, said visually appealing. These are very visually appealing images. A lot of impact. You got the burnt out building standing above the skies, kind of towering above the landscape. You got the woman crying at the table for lawyers. So there's a very visually appealing element to it. And so, just even briefly looking at the front page of a news site can give you a very good sense of how these criteria are influencing what gets reported. So what are some of the effects that all these criteria have? What are the effects of gatekeeping? Well, the first is there's a very strong bias towards reporting on familiar, visible figures, especially if there's unusualness or controversy involved. In other words, if you want to get in the news and you're not somebody who's been reported on a lot, you got to do something either controversial or something very unusual. Otherwise, news will kind of just keep talking about the same people that people have already developed familiarity with. They can develop a narrative about who this person is, that sort of thing. There's a lot of focus on conflict, crime, scandals, and a lot of political news is horse race coverage. So it's the strategy of the game, the competition between the parties, instead of a focus on in-depth investigation of issues and policy positions. And so this is where you get the term infotainment. It's information packaged in an entertaining package, but in a way that often kind of emphasizes the entertainment over the information. The need for breaking news often means, and the lack of resources often means, that there's not a lot of interest in long-term problems, highly technical problems that take a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of expertise to report on. Because of the connections between media and government elites and other elites from other organizations, there is a lot of support for the traditional establishment. So when they do report on, say, corruption or misconduct, the perception is that this is a deviation from what things should be. So sort of the ideal of the establishment is maintain support, not a lot of criticism for the establishment in of itself. It's just politician committed an act of corruption. This is seen as a failure to do their public duty. Anti-establishment behavior is painted in a negative light. So protests, particularly protests that maybe get violent, rioting, things like that, painted in very negative lights. Doesn't have to maybe go that far, but just anti-establishment behavior in general, things that deviate from the norms, often get cast in more negative light. So I mentioned, one area in particular where the need for late breaking and deadlines and stuff like that could cause issues in reporting in a crisis. And so reporting in a crisis goes in sort of 3 stages. And there's a resource called On the Media that I put in a very useful infographic that just sort of says what you should probably do when it comes to reporting or getting and consuming information during a news crisis. So in the first stage of covering a crisis is announced, media becomes a primary source of information, often even for government officials. So many government officials learn of the crisis because of the media coverage. But there's also the point where there's a lot of speculation and unreliable information being passed around. And once that information's out there, it can be very hard to sort of bring it back in and correct. The old adage that a lie is halfway around the world before the truth even gets its shoes on. Stage 2, media attempts to correct past errors and contextualize it. So they try to correct their errors and try to put the situation into context. This is also the stage where government attempts to try to control the political fallout and, make things not look as bad as they appear, that the government has a handle on it, that the government is able to do something, that sort of thing. And then in the last stage, once the crisis has sort of been contained, the media can start focusing on what is this crisis within a larger context, a larger perspective, past failures or successes, what does it mean for future issues, coming to grips and dealing with the aftermath of the crisis. This is where the media can maybe, for example, start getting critical of government handling of the crisis and how, say, maybe failure to handle the crisis might impact an election or something like that. So this is where they try to put the crisis within the larger context. So the media arrives, primary source of information, and as the crisis is contained and more distance from the event, the more the media starts trying to focus, what does this crisis mean within the context of larger things? So, for example, you can think of a school shooting where the media reports on the shooting, tells of what happens to the shooters, and then starts discussing, for example, say, what does that shooting mean within the context of a gun control discussion, for example. So that would be an example of stages 1, 2, and 3. Another major area that media is involved in is investigative journalism. So this is when the media has the resources to do it. This is where the journalists are investigating something. And the common term you'll hear for this is muckraking, which historically has been, sensational exposés of corruption, usually involving high-status individuals and organizations. So you have, for example, Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, famous piece of muckraking that dealt with the conditions of workers in meat packing factories, for example. And he did it on the basis of trying to bring attention to the plight of the workers and employees of these factories. Main result was people realizing that how meat was produced in the United States was very gross and unhygienic, and led to the development of the Food and Drug Administration. Not quite what he meant to do, but, got some kind of result, which is better than a lot of investigative journalism. But investigative journalism essentially has three goals: produce exciting stories, gain praise from fellow journalists, and trigger political action. So these are the sort of motivations that might push a journalist to investigate. They want to produce an exciting story. They want to get recognition from other journalists. So investigative journalism usually wins a lot of awards, Pulitzer Prizes, things like that. And they want to trigger some kind of reaction. They want to report on this and hope something happens to correct the issue. And that's where we get into this example, David Fahrenthold, again, from the Washington Post, this is an interview with him on election night. He was investigating to the extent to which the Trump Organization was an effective charity, and his reports basically suggested that the Trump Organization was not really a charity organization at all, that most of the money was either from other sources who donated to it, not Trump himself, and was often used to purchase things for the benefit of Donald Trump, such as portraits, paying off legal fees, things like that. There was very little charity work going through this organization. He received a Pulitzer Prize for this research, and he is still investigating it, trying to get information to the extent of Trump's charitable donations. This is an interview with it, and is a good example of the sort of investigative journalism that you still see. But note, he works for the Washington Post. Washington Post has a lot of resources. This sort of in-depth investigative journalism is going to be much harder for local or state news to pull off. And that's going to be and that lack of resources is a very big deal for a lot of things about the ability of the press to serve as a check on government officials through investigative journalism.
I'm wondering if you think that you made a mistake in either in exclusively using your private email.
Hillary Clinton has been asked that question since 2015, when the New York Times first reported her use of a private email server as Secretary of State. Just one of many bombshell revelations that have rocked the election campaign. But it's the investigative reporting around Clinton's opponent that has dominated news coverage.
What is your tax rate?
It's none of your business. You'll
tried to arrange for dealings in Cuba, and they
just a small sample of what journalists like the Washington Post's David Fahrenthold have unearthed about Donald Trump's public dealings and private life. Fahrenthold contacted every charity Trump claimed had benefited from him or his foundation. The work took months, but yielded dizzying headlines. It's no surprise that the reaction to Fahrenthold's findings has been as polarized as the campaign itself.
Oh, this is the Washington Post, who's rapidly looking for something to take Mr. Trump down.
That doesn't mean it's not true. Washington Post reporter who seems a little obsessed with Donald Trump these days.
Criticism of a newspaper that's seen by many as the vanguard of investigative journalism, famous for breaking the Watergate scandal. Will the investigative journalism that's been done during this campaign ultimately come to be seen in the same celebrated light?
So, David, let me start there. Do you think that the journalism being done now is going to be remembered as hitting the high water mark or falling short of that?
I don't think people generally remember campaign coverage as being any great high watermark of journalism. It's too fast moving, and there's often not enough focus on any one particular thing. But there have been some really good things in this campaign. A lot of instances where people have focused on one topic, particularly in Trump or Clinton's background. That Times story you mentioned, this New York Times story that discovered Clinton's private email server last year, that was a big deal. Their story on Trump's tax returns that were mailed to them anonymously was a big deal. There's been others that have kind of changed the campaign, but nothing like Watergate that actually brought down a sitting president.
Let's talk about the journalism that you did. And it's interesting because a lot of people are holding it up as exactly this is what investigative journalism is. You actually pick up the phone and you start doing some research. So tell me what you did and what do you think about the fact that people are talking about it as an example of things that, frankly, we should all be doing all the time?
Well, that part is extremely flattering. For me, what's important here was that Trump holds so many important things about himself. It keeps them private. It doesn't tell you. You have to trust him. What are his debts? What does he pay in taxes? How much money is he actually worth? The good thing for me about the studying his charity was that there's actually another party in the transaction. You can call somebody and find out whether Donald Trump lived up to his promises. And specifically, you can call the charities that he promised to help or that he might have been helping to see, well, okay, if Donald Trump has been doing what he said he did, there should be tens of millions of dollars out there in the hands of charities and grateful charities saying, thank you, Donald Trump, that I could find. So that's what I set out to do, was to find outsiders who could check something very important about Donald Trump.
And what did you find ultimately?
So I've now called more than 430 charities, and these are charities that seemed close to Trump. The Trump people haven't cooperated at all. They haven't given me a list of the charities Trump helped. They just said, oh, he gives tens of millions of dollars and it's out there someplace. I've kind of reverse engineered that list. I've got to 430 charities, and all those phone calls have found one gift out of Trump's own pocket between 2008 and May of this year. That was a gift for less than $10,000 in 2009. That's the only gift that I've found out of his own pocket when there's supposed to be tens of millions out there.
It's incredible, and it is good work. And I'm wondering, though, if you think the level of scrutiny that's been brought to both these people will continue past Tuesday, in particular focused on whomever wins, or is there going to be a sense of, you got to go hands off now because they've been chosen by the people?
I don't think that will happen in either case. I think either one of these candidates is likely to face probably renewed scrutiny if they win, because there'll be a Congress, especially Clinton. She will probably have a Republican Congress interested in investigating her. If Trump wins, I think there'll be even more people out there investigating him, because people will now realize, wow, he's going to be the president. We need to learn more about his background and his relationships.
Where are you going to be Tuesday night?
I'll be here. My job is to write the web story that will tell people when the race has been called for Clinton or for Trump. So one of the jobs in the next few days is to pre-write the long story that says Clinton wins and the long one that says Trump wins, so we can just slap it on there. I don't have to write it on the fly when the race is called.
And just make sure you press send on the right one.
Yeah.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
So, models of muckraking, just basic ideas of how muckraking. So the simple model is basically you investigate something, you publicize the results spur on public opinion, and public pressures government to initiate new policy initiatives to deal with the problem, and then consequences, and the policy initiatives, do something, there's consequences for it. In reality, this doesn't really happen too much. And the model is more of a often very moderate response and often long delayed. And there's several reasons. The first is public opinion is really hard to move. A lot of people don't quite pay attention to news, particularly as more entertainment options have increased. And just public in general is always very hard to move. It's hard to spur people onto action. A lot of times politicians also believe they can just wait it out. So, you get a bad press cycle, it'll fade away eventually. Public forgets, moves on. And then, of course, it's just difficult to implement policy in general, which is what every other political science class you should have or will be taking probably has taught you. So just the difficulty of implementing new policy initiatives in of itself means there's often a long delayed response between the initial investigation and an eventual outcome. Other models, you have the leaping impact model. So basically, it's a simple model, but steps get skipped. Usually, this is a situation where journalists report on something, and this leads to political elites acting even if there's no public pressure. Just there's a report, government finds out about something, because remember, government officials oftentimes get news from the same news media as you and me. So they hear something, and they do something about it, even if maybe the public's not pressuring it. Or maybe they're acting preemptively to forestall publicity. It's like, oh, you're going to report something bad on us? Well, we'll get it fixed. Just don't release the report. Or they're just kind of acting preemptively to deal with something. And this is often going to be the model that's followed when news and government collaborates to investigate something. And then finally, a very common result is the truncated model, which is elements of the model are stalled or aborted. It's just the investigation doesn't get published because it's not perceived as a good story. The public doesn't react. Public officials don't react. You hit a dead end. Nothing happens. Just that's it. And that's a very common outcome for these investigations is maybe the public gets mad for a little while, politicians wait it out, nothing happens. Or you get a lawsuit threat, company doesn't want to risk it, they don't publish the story. That sort of thing. Other ways that journalists can influence the news is by basically involving themselves in the news as political actors themselves. And there's three ways that journalists tend to do that. The first is acting as surrogates. So this is where they directly involve themselves in political events. oftentimes through investigation, so they investigate something and report on it, and that sparks some kind of event, some political action. Another common way is, particularly if you're dealing with crime, is to broadcast information on crime, unsolved crimes. So, famous example is the show America's Most Wanted, which would, talk about unsolved crimes and encourage people who might have information to contact the authorities with information that could help be used to solve the crimes. Acting as surrogates, directly getting involved and basically almost in a sense doing the government's job for them. They're doing the investigation, they're trying to get people to get information, that sort of thing. They're the one, they're acting as a surrogate, they're taking on some of the investigation and sort of law enforcement task and using their resources to investigate and publicize issues to get it out there. Another way, acting as mouthpieces. So oftentimes individuals will leak or provide information to the media resources who will then publish those resources, publish those, stories, interest groups will take advantage of this, relationship where the news wants information to try to seek out sympathetic, journalists and provide them this information, to provide them with interesting news stories. So for example, here's The Intercept, a more liberal-oriented news site that in June published an NSA report that had been leaked to them about Russian efforts to hack voter information databases during the 2016 election. Just to be clear, there's no evidence that there were any votes changed. This was more about getting access to just basic voter information. This report was provided to them by a contractor who worked with the NSA. I believe her name was Reality Winner. And so she saw information that, for one reason or another, she believed needed to be released publicly. Provided it to The Intercept, which in the past had published, for example, Edward Snowden's leaks, NSA leaks. So perceived them as a friendly news source, and then they released it. Or you have Director Comey, who contacted a friend of his, or former FBI Director Comey, who contacted a friend of his, who then provided information to news outlets about memos Comey had written about conversations with Donald Trump. These are all very, just examples of how media can serve as surrogates, where interest groups or individuals leak and provide information to the media, who then report that information out there. Probably the biggest way that media influences things, however, is by being the chief framers. Now, framing effects will be discussed more in detail next week in the media effects. But basically, how they report a story influences the perception of the story. In other words, how they report a story influences the perception of that story. So, for example, I have two headlines, one from the Daily Signal, which is a conservative news site, and one from Vox, a more liberal news site, about the Paris Climate Accords. The conservative website paints it as a respect to American citizens, and conservative media in general said this was a good move, it's respectful of constitutional processes, about treaty making, things like that. So they framed it in a positive manner, as a respectful to American citizens and American constitutional processes. Liberal sites, more supportive of the accord, however, painted it in the way that Vox did here, which is some men just want to watch the world burn, that Trump pulling out of the accords was a sign of America giving up global leadership on the issue and would dramatically, and would have negative effects on global climate change in the future. So the same issues being discussed, the same basic fact. Trump pulled the U.S. out of the accord, Paris Climate Accord. The same basic issue, same basic fact. Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord, but framed very differently to determine whether or not it was a good or bad thing. Now, one of the most common frames you'll see in news media, one of the most common frames you'll see in political news, however, is the horse race or strategy frame, where the emphasis is on the sort of fighting between parties and does this provide an advantage in elections or whatever, which usually means less substantive coverage of the issue itself. In other words, they don't go in depth on the issue because they're too busy determining, will this be a good or bad thing for Trump or the Democrats or whatever political figure is being discussed. And this can encourage cynicism about politics. But a lot of this we'll talk about more in some of the future weeks. So, final sort of topic, bias in the media. So a common perception, depending on how you talk to, is either the media is biased in a liberal direction, because journalists generally are moderate to liberal, or it's biased in a conservative direction because it's mostly owned by corporations The reality is, though, is that outside of very clearly partisan ideological news sources, so like The Intercept or Fox News or MSNBC or Vox or National Review, whatever, some sources very clearly have an ideological viewpoint. But if you're talking traditional media, the evidence suggests that there is a legitimate effort to present news as fair and balanced as they possibly can, and that that evidence of intentional ideological bias is relatively sparse. Instead, the bigger things that tend to influence gatekeeping is norms, institutions, and economic pressures. In other words, if you look at that list of 3 forms of bias, the bigger ones tend to be affective biases and informational biases. Ideological is not so much of a concern outside of very obvious partisan media sources. So affective biases are essentially the economic pressures that incentivize attack journalism. In other words, the media is heavily biased towards cynical, negative news coverage because that sort of news coverage is very attention-grabbing. Research by Diana Mutz, who you'll read next week for, Media Effects, finds that negative, uncivil news media is more physically arousing in the sense of it gets your body, that like shot of adrenaline. It's just your body gets more prepared to view and consume the information, I guess is the best way to put it. Put it simple, uncivil media is more attention-grabbing. And because it's more attention-grabbing, perceived as more newsworthy, which means they're more likely to publish it. The result of a lot of this cynicism, negativity, incivility, however, as again you'll read next week with Mutz, is that while people might remember the information and pay attention to it more, it has very negative effects on political trust, and people tend to perceive the opposition as illegitimate when they're portrayed as uncivil and often in conflict. People usually excuse their own side for being uncivil, but, perceiving your opposition as illegitimate has some very serious negative consequences for political deliberation and discourse. If you don't believe your opposition's legitimate, you're unlikely to listen to them, care about their concerns, things like that. And so, affective bias is probably the biggest bias in news. There's a lot of emphasis on cynical negative coverage, especially of political events. Informational biases, and this is where Bennett, Chapter 2, one of your outside readings, is important. Personalization. So there's emphasis on the human interest side of a story than the policy or context. So this is why news stories, even about policies, spend a lot of time focusing on interviewing people and talking about the personal stories of people. It's giving the human face of the story, but it also means that, not a lot of emphasis on the policy and social context of that issue. There's an emphasis on dramatization. So in other words, you paint the issue as dramatic, but leave out maybe the long-term issues, the more persistent problems that led to that dramatic event. And this is where you get fragmentation. In other words, because of the emphasis on personal individuals in a dramatic moment, the moment appears isolated from other events. Just, this is a person and this thing happened to them. But there's not a lot of emphasis on sort of the long-term social and political and economic context that led to that issue. It's just, something happened to this person, isn't it sad? Or isn't it something that should make you angry? But not a lot of why did this happen to this person? And more importantly, it also means that information is very sketchy. You'll hear a little bit about an event from this story, and then in another story, and then in another story. And so, if you put all the stories together, you might get a comprehensive, package and information on an issue or a policy. But in terms of how you actually consume, everything's just sort of this fragmented collage of independent events. It gets very hard and it's very difficult to sort of connect them all and get a greater understanding of, there's this systematic, persistent problem that's sort of the root of all these stories that I'm hearing about. But the media's focus on drama and personalization means that it becomes much harder to sort of connect all these stories and get to underlying systematic issues. And then finally, there's the authority disorder bias. It's basically put it, the adage, no news is good news. Well, basically that amounts to is, if everything's going fine, you usually don't report on it. You only usually report and provide information when things go wrong. So there's a lot of focus on to the extent of how is authority keeping order and maintaining order in this dramatic situation. But since order and calm and stability doesn't provide good news stories, the media tends to constantly emphasize conflict and drama and crime, sort of, almost presenting that there's a constant state of crisis. And that'll be especially important when we talk about, say, how the news reports on crime. Just to briefly kind of get to it, because the news often reports on violent crime over other criminal issues, there's been a long history of a gap between people perceiving high levels of violent crime and the actual levels of violent crime being very low. Finally, ideological biases. Again, most of the research seems to suggest that most traditional news media at least does try to make an effort to be unbiased. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The thing is, though, historically speaking, sensationalist partisan press was actually the history of most of the U.S. media. So early American media, for example, was outright owned by political parties and was used primarily to advance the interests of the political party by publishing stories in a way that favored the party's view. So, for example, when Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay published the Federalist Papers, they did it by publishing a newspaper and publishing the stories in them. It wasn't until advances in printing technology gave more people the ability to begin opening independent presses that you start getting an independent media. So the first examples of this were the penny presses. So they sold the newspaper for a penny and made up the rest of the money through advertising revenue. Whereas in the past, newspapers were more expensive and aimed at the upper class. The result was, because of the need for ad revenue and to make up more subscription money, they had to appeal to a wider audience, which meant highly sensationalist, highly dramatic, muckraking sort of journalism, which developed into yellow journalism, with the biggest examples being Hearst and Pulitzer's media sort of empires. Highly sensational, highly dramatic, might have been a major cause of the Spanish-American War, where I think Hearst in particular really pushed for war, blamed the explosions that, destroyed the Maine on Spain, which in conjunction with McKinley wanting to expand American power, were big pushes for the Spanish-American War. On the other hand, the financial success of their papers did lead them to start establishing schools of journalism. And these schools of journalism, and treating journalism as a profession, did start to lead to these sort of journalistic norms about objectivity and fairness and investigation and things like that pushes towards more objective reporting. And so, during the age of broadcast television, for example, where corporations were owning it from the beginning, you do have that sort of golden age of the, say, media as represented by, for example, Walter Cronkite. But a lot of that was because of economic pressures. So, because, for example, remember, the FCC, if you're going to be on broadcast, you have to do public service and news. The news was seen as a lost leader. In other words, the news wasn't expected to make money. The news was there because they had to, and allowed them to build reputation. You became the news channel that had Walter Cronkite. So people would watch, the entertainment shows, they'd watch the news, and they'd watch other stuff. And so you brought people in with using the news as maybe brand loyalty, met your government obligations, but it wasn't expected to make money. And you needed to maintain a mass audience. But with the development of the cable, television, and internet, you started getting less of a need for that. You could go for more niche markets, and there was an expectation news would have to start making money. And so you get the rise of infotainment and essentially our modern news system, which in all honesty harkens back to the era of the more explicitly partisan press and yellow journalism. And so that sort of golden age of the Walter Cronkites of media was a golden age, I guess, from a certain perspective, was more of a blip in the historical record than the actual state of media. Most media historically has been more sensational and outright partisan. And the current, and you'll definitely get into this in week 4 with Pryor's work, Marcus Pryor's work, current media environment favors sensationalist partisan media over the more objective, less offensive, less clearly partisan media of the broadcast area of the era of Walter Cronkite. Still, even with that in mind, like I said, outside of very clearly partisan media, most of the research seems to suggest that the media does make an effort to try to remain ideologically neutral. Maybe have a little bit of a leaning to the left, a little to the right, depending on your source. So, for example, Wall Street Journal, I believe, tends to lean maybe a bit more to the right than others, but still well within a range of what we might call moderate. Within the news, editorial section, whole different story. But people still perceive media as biased, and there's a couple of reasons. First, in the past, concerns about partisan media were driven by the fact that we thought audiences as passive. Just, they got the information, they absorbed it, that was it. That's not the case. Audiences actively engage with the media. And so this active engagement means very different theories on how ideological bias and partisan media could have an influence, or how people perceive it. So for example, hostile media effect. Part of the reason why partisans perceive media as hostile to their views is because every partisan tends to view media as hostile to their views. Strong partisans, routinely report higher levels of perception of the news as biased than weaker partisans, regardless of the news source. Now, some of the evidence suggests that yes, this might be stronger on the conservative side than liberals, so Republicans, conservatives tend to view the media as biased towards them at stronger levels than liberals and Democrats, but liberals and Democrats do it too. You have selective exposure, so partisans consume favorable media over other options. Again, strong partisans, liberals watch MSNBC, conservatives watch Fox News, tend to avoid other media that they perceive as being biased against them or puppets for the other side. And then finally, something in favor of partisan media not being as strong as perceived, conditional learning. Most people just aren't interested in watching partisan news media. They'd rather go watch an entertainment show. Cable and internet provides plenty of opportunities to do so people do that. And you'll get into selective exposure and conditional learning a lot more next week. Hostile media effects, pretty straightforward. I don't discuss it too much next week in media effects. Again, though, this isn't to say that there's no bias. It's just not as strong as people perceive it, and it might not be as big of a deal as we might think. But there is some evidence of bias. So, for example, newspapers do tend to have more favorable reporting of candidates that they endorse. But that's really going to be influential mostly at the state and local level. If you're talking presidential elections, newspaper endorsements really don't seem to have had as much of an impact as they maybe have had in the past. Things like partisanship are more important. The news might favor certain organizations' terminology, so they might be a bit more willing to adopt certain organizations' phrasing than others. So, for example, you can imagine debates about, say, the terms undocumented versus illegal alien, or debates on terms of radical Islam versus some other term, things like that. So certain news organizations might be biased a bit more towards a liberal or conservative terminology, while still basically reporting the same information. Might have a little effect with framing effects, but again, most of the research seems to suggest that the concern that your particularly traditional media is partisan bias doesn't really pan out. Again, this is very different if you're talking, say, your cable 24-hour news networks like Fox News or MSNBC, or your blogs or things like that. Those, if it's a clear partisan bias, it's a clear partisan bias. No argument there. But this is more your New York Times, Washington Post type. And then finally, another way that bias can appear is if they routinely tend to cite certain organizations, and the organizations themselves might be biased. But again, if you're talking your traditional media, they do tend to try to report maybe from multiple sources. Maybe they lean on some sources more than others that might have a bit of a bias, and so maybe present information that's slightly skewed. But the research seems to suggest that this is not like some intentional manipulation on the part of the news media, but more of about, again, those organizational and economic pressures that push them towards certain source gathering strategies that might favor certain groups over others. And so that basically concludes week 2's lecture on how media gets presented. Again, a lot of it basically amounts to news is biased towards having dramatic, conflict-driven stories over other options. And this is a result of various structural and economic pressures over clear attempts at ideological manipulation. That's it for this week. Don't forget to do your quiz and your response for this week. That is all.